So this, I'm not sure if you can see the top here. If you can see the top of this document, this has been the standard and the evolved form of the data collection sheet that Urban Collaborative has been using. And this has kind of evolved from numerous interactions between the Searle team and the Urban Collaborative group, primarily collecting data for these SCPs. But now that it's here, I believe that that they're also okay with it being freely available for all to use. We'll have to double check on that, but here's the sheet that we've been using. I think it's a great way that we can use as kind of a talking point to walk through this. I added a priority column. I think this will be really useful, and we'll talk through it quickly, and then we're going to have Richard take over to talk about some of the details. That there may be some more questions on doing this. But overall, there's some information that's really a high priority to gather during the data collection. And I'll take one step further back and say, when we start a study, we're going to get the GIS information in, and hopefully there'll be some information there that'll help us categorize these buildings into facility groups. So we're trying to determine primarily the era that it was constructed and the type of building. Those are, two of the most important things, and we'll use that information to group each building into different facility groups, into a facility group that most closely approximates the way that that building is used and how it's going to behave. So we can do that often from GIS data originally, and then we just want to correct from there. Hopefully, and especially in an ideal situation, we do that first and then have a discussion with the installation before anyone goes out on a data collection event, and kind of talk through that list and make sure that we've got all the buildings pretty well categorized into the building type and the appropriate era that it should fit in. All right, so once that's done, we should be pretty close even at that starting point. When we go to the data collection, the focus should be on making any changes that significantly, one, where there was a big difference between what we thought this building was, how old it was, and what it was used for. But then also, if there are any significant changes to the building away from that, or especially to that building group, away from the defaults. So if we've got major renovations that would make it not act the way that that default facility group would act. So basically, again, as an emphasis, there are default numbers for each of these fields in the tool already for the model that already exists for that facility type of a given era. And the real things that we're trying to capture here are deviations from those default values. So I marked down, with 10 being the highest priority, 1 being the lowest priority, where each of these things sit. So being able to identify what building this is, the building number and its name and all that kind of stuff, obviously these are high priorities. Construction date is going to go along with kind of building era. And then whether or not it's planned to be demolished, so this is going to affect its status for the base case and all alternatives going forward, and the condition square footage, partly so we can match it up, make sure this is the same building that we're looking at in the GIS data that has been given. And then from there, there's only a few more that are really high priority. I mentioned already the facility type, the building era, any renovations. These are major renovations that are going to change the behavior for the building. And then we get down to a lot of significantly lower priority items, some things that are going to be difficult to determine, and I think that's where maybe some of the anxiety has come about in relationship to collecting this data in the first place, where it might be difficult to find out if there's insulation or related to the roof and that kind of thing, or where, how thick. But this is much lower priority. We're already going to have a default value that should be appropriate for that era, for that building type. There's at least a fair amount of consistency within the the way the Army's been building in these different eras, and so we have a value that should make sense for this building. And the important thing about changing it would be if there's a significant difference between that and the existing default value. Similarly, a lot of the rest of this, luckily, partly for this process, the more difficult it is to get a hold of this information, generally it's less critical for the modeling, partly because we already have good default information for it. And it kind of continued down through these. Lighting, usually a little bit easier to get a hold of and a little bit more valuable, especially if they've done renovations or something else and they've replaced some of their lighting with higher efficiency lighting. And then we get down to the equipment, the heating and cooling equipment. And here again, it jumps to a really high priority level. It makes a big difference what type of unit is being used or what type of system is being used to heat and cool these buildings. It makes a big difference from an energy perspective and also from a planning perspective. You'll see these lower district options. And I combined these. Normally these are all broken out. I just combined them to give the same priority level here. And I'm thinking that maybe even in the future we might be able to keep some of this priority information in one way or another attached to the document to help out with future people that are using, going on these data collection events. But it's not that difficult to find out what type of heating and cooling systems are being used for those buildings. So we can go through the mechanical rooms, and even chilling systems usually you can see from the outside and see that equipment. And then whether or not it's connected to a district system is an important piece of information that has sometimes been overlooked in the past, or we've had trouble consistently determining it for each building, but that's a really important aspect as well. And again, a trip to the mechanical room will answer all of those questions. We'll scan down a couple more things, and then I didn't actually fill in for waste or water. I was going to let Richard weigh in on those. He's worked a little bit more with that as well. And up to this point, we haven't been providing water and waste feedback from the tool to the contractors. That's something that we're hoping to change here shortly. So at this point, I wanted to turn it over. Richard has better information, or definitely more details on kind of the importance and how you would collect some of the more detailed information as well. Comments, Richard?
Yeah, so first thing I was looking at this and thinking some things that we still might want to add to this. So we're now looking at the phasing, and we see construction date, but it would also be nice to have the we see demolish, yes or no, but it'd be nice to have the demolish date if it's a retrofit, when there might be a planned retrofit. Or we could say retrofitted, yes or no, and then also, and same thing like the demolish, but then also having a date for when we plan to be demolished, and if it's going to be retrofitted, we then put it, we might say retrofitted no, but we have a retrofit date in there. So just starting to get a little bit more in line with providing those dates that we need to put in the facility section. And then the other thing is that these are good to have the values here, but the things that are something that we might want to consider is just if we are allowed to do photo documentation of the building, if we could put a range of the picture numbers that go in there. So just if we're looking at it, we have our camera, or whatever, however it delineates that. If we could somehow get those numbers, the range of that, so from, just say from 130 to 142 is that building. And then as we look through this data, I don't think we have all the facility types in here. I think that's we're missing. We're up somewhere close to somewhere in it, and I don't believe that. I know it's got other, and you can put the name in there, but if we we might want to put a few more of the facility types that we have in there, so that I don't see some of the medical stuff and things like that. So if we can make the determination exactly what that facility type is, in other words, make it either here on paper, or if you're doing it live, actually putting it in for that building. But assuming we're going to do it on paper, or in this case, in this spreadsheet, we should have at least have all facility types available, so the person can actually make the determination right there. I think I want it to be a barracks, and then what I think would be is interesting as you start to sort this and collect all this information, we can see how many are showing up in how many individual buildings, because what happens is that we might have, let's just say we have 20 buildings that are pretty similar, and it's ASHRAE 2004, and then we have 2 buildings that are ASHRAE 2007, and they're not that big, but we've added another facility group because of that. And so, as you can see, of the buildings, what the square footage is, where the energy usages are, and if we're at a point where those are, because 2004, 2007, fairly close, right? And you can run all these experiments for yourself at some point. But the point is that you should be able to graphically see that, because you're doing this. Each row here, D, E, F, G, is supposed to be a new, a new and different building, and so you can start looking across this, and you might be able to, go through this and sort by facility type, do the sort, horizontally by facility type by row instead of column, and it probably shows some interesting characteristics that we can see from this. I don't believe all the building errors are there. We might have ASHRAE 2013 in there as well. We'd have to check on that. We can always add another era in there. And then scroll down a little bit now. Matt's busily making these changes, and that's great.
Mm-hmm.
May as well just do it. Get it done. As Matt said, for the envelope, the things that are important to us are really, we can see what the era gives us in the envelope. So the things that are really important to us is kind of, is it wood frame, metal frame, mass walls being some type of concrete, either block or what, or how that goes. So setting up kind of that big picture of the structure, and then it's not interesting to me to say that it's say for wall pipe that it's insulated, and you put an X next to it, so that doesn't help, right? And if we're going to, that's kind of the low level. But if we go in there and we because what we're trying to find is something that might give us an indication of our value. So yeah, we want to indicate what we're seeing, like if it's brick veneer, if it's stucco, wood, metal siding, same thing on the roofs. If we see it's insulation above deck, and it's a metal roof, those can make a difference, but they're not. It's not huge compared to knowing how much if it's really insulated or if it's not insulated. And then leaky normal and tight helps. Currently, our vintage sets those in, gives you a default level for the insulation, assuming kind of on big statistical averages that buildings weren't as insulated in mid-century, in many cases uninsulated in mid-century, and then pre-1980 they were not as insulated. And then when the energy crisis hit, we actually started insulating, and then as we moved along and our building codes kicked in the late 90s, early 2000s, that we started prescribing to, we started building to those levels. It gets easier to kind of think, knowing that they probably had to build to code, and most of the cases they built to the minimum. We have a pretty good idea of what could be in those buildings, in the walls. But any information that we can get out of that, just to give us an idea, is always important. Windows, double pane, single pane, that's kind of a biggie. Operable, not operable, those are biggies. If it's tinted or not, if we can, and normally, like I said, that's visible. We can just kind of see that information by observation and or taking a picture of that. But those are, so the envelope on a big building, and if you think about where do I want to put my energy into this, if you're looking at the envelope of a big building, and let's just say it's standard construction, it's got a fair amount of interior space compared to the envelope, is that the building's not going to be envelope driven, right? So when you get to smaller and smaller buildings, all the way down to residences, then it becomes more envelope driven. So we want to put more emphasis on the envelope as we get smaller and smaller. Leakiness, how much air leaks in, and remember we're looking at the envelope itself, and we're looking at kind of the operation of it, right? So if we go to places, and we're seeing that doors are typically propped open and inoperable windows, and a lot of them are open. That needs to account for, we want to say it's going to be on the leakier side, but even if we do all this stuff to tighten the envelope, having those big intentional holes at that point, the envelope isn't going to do much, right? We can tighten the walls and that's up, but people leave the windows open. It doesn't make much difference. So we want to know if we can see some of that operational stuff. I've seen that in observation. So if you see sandbags, the little sandbags they put at the door to hold them open, and they're there as you walk in. They're right there as a standard feature. You can get an idea that those doors are probably propped open quite a bit. So those are indications that you want to look at, and so you look at the things that give you your bang for your buck. And so on a big building, I look at the windows, single pane, double pane, big deal. Even in a large building, that's a big deal. Whether it's tinted or not, that's a big deal. Wall to window area. We were at certain places, and supposedly a LEED building, but then just a wall of windows. And there's always the caveat which says, well, if they do it such and such, it can be okay. But in many cases, that window to wall area is always going to be important, to know. So, like I said, you kind of look at all that, and you can invest your effort in those areas. As we go down to lighting, typically what happens in a modern building is that the lighting is designed to one of the ASHRAE standards. They either do it by the entire building has to be at a budget, or they do the space method. And so it's kind of, do you see that you can count fixtures in a type of space, and you can get an idea of how that is compared to what the standard is for that. You can get a rough idea. Typically what happens even in older buildings, and that's why there's not a huge difference in lighting numbers going back to mid-century buildings and all this, is that the lighting has been updated on a much higher frequency than the rest of the building. And so that the lighting ends up being a lot of times at a more modern level, even in old buildings. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to walk into areas and still see incandescent bulbs hanging in some storerooms, or a lot of T12 sitting in places. I've gone into places and seen that as well. But in many cases, a lot of that stuff has already been updated. And so if you can do a sampling, count your ceiling tiles, whatever, get your area, count your fixtures. There's a lot of standard watts per fixture type. You can rough that in pretty quick. It's not necessarily, as I said, it's kind of, I think it's more in kind of that priority 4, priority 5, because in many cases, if it's a little bit newer building or this is probably going to be closer to the default anyway. And where the real benefit comes in the lighting is when you go in and you do kind of a real detailed lighting design going forward, where you start really looking at the indirect, direct, task lighting, and cutting down. What I think the biggest thing that we find in many cases, and if you happen to do these with a lumen meters, that you'll find that in many cases that many spaces are overlit, and that's where you can get big savings, is when you run across kind of tendency for you getting consistently, you're finding buildings that are overlit, and in that case you might want to get a sampling of the lighting, of the wattage level per square foot, and like I said, doing that simple calculation to get that. For washer and dryers, in most of the models, they're making an assumption by occupancy. Exhaust fans is pretty much assumed that they're going a couple that are typical, soda machine, and a candy bar machine in a big building. If you just have a couple like that, then it's not a big deal. But if you go to some areas where there's a lot of those, and they're kind of the old, the newer ones are getting much better. But vending machines and elevators, I think take up more energy than what a lot of people think. And so just kind of want to note that would have to be added in, kind of beef up the equipment loads a little bit. As we move down, and we've talked about this in the past, trying to get the type of the heating and cooling system in there. So if it's a multi-zone, a VAV, if you can get that information, that makes a big difference. So if you got fan coils versus VAV in a building, especially when you get around that 1980-ish era, what happened on the military side is, in that area, is that some of them were more progressive, and as VAV systems were coming in, they were kind of early adopters, and there's others that absolutely just stayed with the most standard, cheapest equipment they could possibly put in to meet minimum cost, and that's just like I said previously, those are systems that it's really difficult to retrofit. Even in a deep energy retrofit, it's really difficult to go in and kind of do a wholesale because of the complexity of taking ductwork, all the controls and sensors and actuators and getting systems. They do that when they get back to mid-century. So if you don't have a forced air system and you've got a piece milled with splits and radiators and things, and they modernize it, then they have a tendency to change those. But if you're in that system where they've taken, let's say it was an old multi-zone, they've kind of made it into a quasi, they've taken out the dual deck stuff and made it single decks, and they're kind of, I don't want to use any harsh adjectives for that system, but where they tried to modernize it without having to, like I said, rip all the equipment out, they blank stuff off and things. You'll see things like that happening, and so kind of getting a feel for that is always helpful. Obviously, if the building is littered with window units, that's and or splits, and are moving from those to centralized a building system. I don't want to say use centralized like Matt's term, but kind of a central system in the building for air distribution versus all the window units, and so you want to get a feel for that as well. we're still trying to group them together. So we're not trying to get each building customized in there, but trying to find how a group of buildings are in there. And we do want to represent their typical operation, not the operation that they might be having, which may be an aberration from the typical. So we do have to look at a lot of different things when we look at this at a planning level. And water and waste, I think that we have what we're really looking at on the water and waste is, especially on the waste side, we're looking to see what we have for for the big programs, if we have recycling or not, if we're composting or not, if we can get the waste numbers. But kind of some of the big things are do we already have a recycling program, and if so, how thorough is that program, or how intense are they following? What is their current divergence on that from going from commingled to breaking it out? And then lastly, the compost. So there's the only areas that really get compost are kind of like the defects, places where you have compostable material even available. So depending, it may or may not. Yeah, the participation rate. That's what we're kind of trying to get an idea on that. We're not trying to get, for the water section, we're not trying to necessarily get a fixture count, even though we can get kind of a rough idea of some of the fixture counts. A lot of times the fixtures, unless they're way different, kind of match up to they match up to kind of the occupancy. So if a building has more occupants, you'll see more fixtures. So there is some of that correlation to building size. But one of the things you really want to look at is if as you look at it, is if they've already made the switch from traditional fixtures of a certain area to the low flow fixtures. And so you really want to see, you're really looking for to see if they've made that change to from standard to low flow fixtures. So you can kind of once again that percentage of we'll call it participation rate to get it for a term there. So if you're seeing a lot of the old 5-gallon per flush systems, and they haven't made the change to 1.6 gallons per systems, those are the things you really want to document. And once again, knowing that the buildings are going to probably attribute for the total water usage at the buildings are probably going to be in that 20-25% range of the total water consumption on most installations. That a lot of the water consumption happens outside of the buildings. It's not all demanded by the buildings. And so we're trying to identify the other water uses that are out there that will eventually we want to account for when we're doing this. And so this is where we want to do a little bit of a top down and bottom up and look at what the building contribution is. So what we don't want to do is take the water bill and say that, well, going from regular fixtures to low flow fixtures, you save, I'll just throw a number out, you save 20%, and then take the top down number and save 20% on it, because that's not, it's really, it's kind of like the 20% of the 20%. That would be the percentage of, like 4% of the total. That's the type of thing that we're really trying to determine by doing the roll up at the building level, is so that we know when we're looking at the building level things that we're looking at the the total, and we look at the building contribution, and and there's kind of this gap, and we want to look around and see if we can find what is what additional things that they are probably doing to consume that difference, or how that difference is there. So we're looking to see, do they irrigate or don't they irrigate? Do they have vehicle wash racks, swimming pools, hotels with swimming pools, physical fitness centers with swimming facilities. So we want to see if we can kind of locate those, so that we can explain sometimes that what that gap is, because we don't want to say it's all, your system's leaking 50%. Could be, right? It could be that bad. But we want to get it down to try to get an idea about what all those additional large water users are outside of the building. And so for my pass through this, Matt, that's kind of what I'm looking at. So what about you?
Make sure I don't think I'm not on mute. Yeah, I thought that was good. I mean, I wish you could give them a little bit more detail on the water and waste. We're still, or at least maybe review this sometime and change some of the text in terms of what we need to collect to provide useful information back. But I think that's still partly in progress. Otherwise, it'd be great to hear. I mean, this was a summary. From my perspective, it seemed like that covered a lot of stuff. I've also been doing it a while, so I'm a little biased. So it would really help out to have some comments from people who are hearing it. Maybe even some Urban Collaborative folks that have done it a few times and still have some questions, or just changes from hearing this.
Yeah, just for example, so I've sat down and talked with them, and we've looked at buildings, and so if you notice, there's three different sizes of office buildings. And what we have here is offices, and see, that's why I'd like to see that broken into this, the office small, office medium, office large. And what we have some idea of square footage, but that doesn't necessarily, the big differences between kind of the small, medium, and large, partially is the size, small, medium, and large, but with those sizes, a lot of times is that the systems change significantly, and so you may have a small office that is package units, and it may go all the way up to a fairly large size, square footage wise, in package units before they kind of jump to a kind of a central building system. And it really depends on what kind of the system is that kind of distinguishes kind of the differences. And so you start with package systems and you move to central system with DX equipment in it. It's direct expansion equipment with air cooled equipment. Then you could even get the large buildings. You're starting to look at cooling towers and bigger boilers and so things like that. So you start seeing there's these big equipment differences that happen between these sizes, and so it's not strictly the size per se. And so we want to have all those facility groups broken out, so that because we don't want to have to rethink it when we start interfacing with the tool. Because what I hate to do is say, okay, it's an office, and it says, okay, well now I got to make the decision. I wasn't there, so if somebody makes that initial decision, that's kind of what happens when you start doing it live. If you're doing it straight into the tool, that you have to make those decisions to make it, to get it to work. And I'd like to kind of tailor that here so that we're starting to make those decisions. So then it just becomes kind of transferring the data, or ultimately we'll put it straight into the tool for a lot of these sections. So that's really how that's where I would want to go with this, Matt. So we're making those decisions. So it's just then becomes
Mm-hmm.
So the person who's there, touching, feeling, whatever, has enough of an idea what's happening at the tool level, to where they can kind of start making those decisions. And if there's questions about that, that's fine. But if you leave it generic like this, we're always going to have those questions because we can't make the somebody. Then we have to go back and make that decision, and then we'll be making that with less information, like looking at the building, and then so those are the types of discussions I've had in the past as we've done this phase, not being there, and then trying to determine what they put here and what the interpretation is to what goes in those inputs.
Right. So we're talking about, potentially being able, and we've talked about this before, but when district personnel go out into the field, they can take the study in its current form out to the data collection, potentially on a laptop with a hotspot. Sometimes we can't do that. A lot of times we actually likely could do it, do the walkthrough, and then directly make changes to the default models. So you're not creating something from scratch. You've got a default model. You're familiar enough with the system to be able to work on this. And then as you go through these buildings, make any updates or changes to the default model for the buildings that fall into that facility group as needed, kind of in real time during the walkthroughs. And at this point, that's limited to the district personnel. It's not something that can be done by contractors.
But having it in here, I think with some sorting and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
it'd probably be really useful to see how the facility groups fall out,
Mm-hmm.
and then seeing if there's there's like I said, a small amount of square footage and/or building counts that could be moved to a different facility group to condense it down. And so there's kind of some benefits to looking at it either way. And like I said, I think it'd be interesting to see if you started sorting first, do a sort on by facility type,
Mm-hmm.
and then facility type, and then building era, and then see how that all kind of just sorting it. And so you go through building by building and put all the information in, and somebody making all those decisions, right? Expanding that list out to include all the model types, and then seeing how that kind of lays out, and then you might, like I said, you might find that there's just this oddball one or two buildings that could be moved in instead of trying to do it later. After you realize, hey, I've got what is it? Let's say 100 buildings and 84 facility types. Well, you pretty much have from a planning level, you've kind of almost customized it. You may as well, you could almost add the additional whatever buildings at that point. You were not going to see a huge difference. But like I said, with enough time and experience doing this, you'll see the differences at times between some of the small differences you think are important. Some are, and some aren't, right? And so we try to highlight the things that do make a big difference, and knowing that if you're doing this at a planning level versus a design level, knowing that we all know that the plans will end up with individual designs, either for the retrofit and/or this. What we're trying to do is tell them, here's a number here's our target. We know we can kind of get there with this set, and if we get all these buildings inside this target, we can facilitate it with this set of technologies on the supply side and purchase this much, and so we're trying to keep our data collection in that perspective as well.
Mm-hmm.